In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a completely stock link pin beam.
Ooh, this thing looks nice.
Okay, so I'm not an actual mechanic. I'm just a hobbyist, a guy who likes to work in his garage. So getting this thing completed was actually more difficult than I thought. I had a lot of trouble, a lot of aggravation along the way. So all the bad parts that make me look like I don't know what I'm doing are going to stay in the video so you can learn from my mistakes. Everything that you won't find in a manual, you'll find in the video.
Got all my suspension parts lined up on this table, ready to go. I like to be organized and have everything lined up so I can just get the job over with and I know I'm not missing anything. It took me several weeks or maybe even months to assemble everything you see here because a lot of the stuff you can't really buy new, like these control arms. Some of this stuff is new, like these bushings here and some of this hardware. These are original Grub Screws. Got a new shock absorber. These are some rebuilt kingpins and spindles.
This is a stock restoration, so I'm starting with a stock Volkswagen link pin beam with needle bearings. I'm painting 2 coats of 2K epoxy primer and 2 coats of 2K black. I let the paint cure for a week, then bolt the beam on.
Okay, bolting this on is actually quite easy. It's basically just 4 bolts. It's as simple as that. They get held on with these retainer plates. Of course, it would be better if I had an assistant right now, but I don't. These bolts get torqued down to 36. Okay, 36 foot-pounds.
And of course, I can't forget to hammer over these retaining tabs so the beam bolts don't come loose.
Okay, so now it's time to clean the torsion leaves up and get those installed in the tubes. Alright, these are the torsion leaves. And so my next step here is basically pretty simple. Just have to clean these off and restack them. Except I'm noticing something here, which is not good. This stack of torsion leaves is complete, and this is incomplete. Looks like the previous owner took out a bunch of these torsion leaves, maybe to soften up the front suspension or lower it or something. Despite my best efforts to make sure I had all the necessary parts, I'm 4 torsion leaves short. But after a 2-week search, I found a rusted out link pin beam that I can use to finish the project. The good thing about it, as you can see, are these torsion leaves. It's a complete set, they're intact. All right, this is gonna be really stinky and really messy. Get this junk out of here. Okay, here we go. Okay, here comes the fun part. Wow, look at this. It's like 60 years of gunk.
Cleaning the old grease off the torsion leaves isn't hard. It's just very messy, obviously, and it has a really bad odor. Once they're clean of the old grease, I re-lubricate them and stack them up in the correct order so the pre-drilled factory dimples are lined up.
All right, next we're gonna put some zip ties in here. And the reason they're here is to stack these together and hold them in tight so I can get them through the fitting inside. All right, so if we take a peek down the center of the tunnel, you can see that there's a square fitting. Torsion leaves have got to slide into that opening. And then the dimple here that's been drilled into the torsion leaves has to appear exactly in this hole, and that's where I'm going to screw it, clamp it down.
There's really no way to see what I'm doing here, so I'm sliding these in by feel and hoping it doesn't give me too much trouble.
Whoa. That one went in. That was exciting.
The lower set of leaves is a little tricky, but eventually they slide in.
There we go. Ugh. Okay, that looks pretty lined up. Just gave it a tap from the side.
For now, I'm putting in the center grub screws with an 8mm Allen wrench, but not tightening them down completely until I install the steering arms and grub screws, top and bottom, left and right. Well, it might be kind of hard to see in this lighting, but I'm not too happy about the zip tie being right on the end here. The zip ties that are in the middle of the tunnel are fine, and you don't need to remove them. But this one at the end might interfere with the controller steering arms, so it's got to come out. Okay, got that off. Okay, I've got upper and lower control arms here, and left and right are interchangeable. So I'm going to do
this upper control arm first. Okay, gonna grease this bad boy up good. Put the bushing on. Both sides of this bushing are identical, and I think it actually should have a flat side, but it doesn't. But at this point, I'm going with it. Okay, so right here is the opening for the grub screw, and the dimple is on the front, so I'm going to angle it this way. So right away I'm having a problem. The control arm is hitting the bracket that comes out of the side of the beam, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure how to make it fit or how to lift it over.
I've only ever built narrowed beams, and they have adjusters, so they don't have this problem. I take a break and I phone a friend. So the issue is that without the weight of the body pressing down against it, the control arm is naturally going to twist downwards and rest against that bracket. Until I get the wheels on the car and on the ground, it's totally normal and fine, and I just need to lift it up over the bracket and drive it in. So I don't need to be concerned about that, and I'm going to keep moving forward. Now for the lower control arm. Exciting. The lower arm goes in with no trouble naturally, and now that I have a clue, the passenger side steering arms are a snap. Next, screw in the remaining grub screws to the steering arms and torque them down. Okay, everything here should be set to 29 to 36 foot-pounds, so I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Safety first. Okay, all these grub screws get set nuts, and these also get torqued down to 29 to 36 or thereabouts. Okay, next I'm going to install 4 of these little grease fittings. I think they're called Zerks. These grease fittings go in last because you don't want to scratch up the control arms as they're pushed into the beam. There's 4 in all, 1 on each side, upper and lower.
No torque setting for these, just snug them down good. Don't go overboard and break them.
Break out your grease gun and keep pumping in each fitting until the grease comes out the sides.
Okay, there it is. Okay, so right here I have my rebuilt spindles, left and right, and they come as a complete assembly with the carrier attached with the brand new kingpin reamed out and installed on here. And what I did was I took my old parts, I mailed them to California, and they did an exchange for these rebuilt spindles. And it's really worth every penny because to do this job, you need special tools and training and know-how that I don't have. So I recommend that to anyone doing this at home. So to install these is really not hard, but the first thing I need to do is measure the offset between the upper control arm and the lower control arm. And as you can see, hopefully, the bottom control arm sticks out further than the upper, and the difference between the two is called the offset. And the reason we care is because when the link pins go through here, they have to be shimmed correctly so that we set up the angle of the wheel. And that's part of the alignment of the front end. So this is a pretty critical step. So the way that I'm going to measure that is pretty simple. Put this ruler straight across the bottom, hold it flat to the bottom so it doesn't move. And I'm going to use my caliper to measure this gap. And I'm getting 7 millimeters. So I know my offset is 7 millimeters. I'm going to do the same thing on the right side and then go over to my manual and consult the chart. Okay, I hope I'm not breaking any copyright laws here. My offset is 7 millimeters, so that tells me I need 3 inner shims on the upper torsion arm and 5 outer shims on the upper torsion arm. And then the lower torsion arm gets 3 inner and 5 outer. I already measured the offset on the passenger side, which is 6 millimeters, so that tells me I need 2 inner upper, 6 outer upper, and then the lower torsion arm gets 4 and 4. Okay, and because that was very confusing and not at all memorable, I've written it down here so I don't forget. Okay, so it occurs to me I've been talking about shims and link pins without really explaining what they are or showing them. So these are the link pins, and they get installed through the kingpin carrier and into the control arms. And each one gets 8 shims, a certain number of inner and outer, as determined by the offset and the chart we just looked at, followed by an O-ring and
a grease seal. Okay, I have my driver's side spindle here, and it's easy to identify because it has a hole through the center of the spindle for the speedometer cable. So I'm going to start with the upper link pin first. I know that this is the outside because the wheel goes here. The link pin goes through the front. So the outer side gets 5 shims. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to grease them up. Doesn't hurt to pre-grease everything, even though it's going to get greased once I install it. Put it on here. Grease this up good. Install it through the upper. Push it in. Turn it over. And I get 3 inner. 1, 2, 3. Get my grease going. Okay, slide these in. Next, my O-ring. Here it is. I don't want to break it along this edge, so I'm going to try to stretch it over. Just be careful. Doesn't tear. Okay. Now, my grease seal. Put a little grease on there. Okay, so I just did the upper and the lower. Get 5 lower outer. And install it through here. Push it all the way in. That leaves me 3 left over. There's always 8 in each link pin. Okay, that's good and greasy. Put that in here. Next, my O-ring and the seal. And I might have to rotate these seals because there's a little nub on here that fits into the control arm, so I want to make sure that's in the right position when I put it in place. Okay, here comes the exciting part. I get the bottom one started a little bit. And push up on the lower control arm. Come on. Okay, in order to get this started, I need to push up on the lower control arm a little bit. So I'm going to use this jack just to lift it up. So on a narrowed adjustable beam, you can loosen up the adjusters and rotate the control arms any which way you want to install the link pins. But on a stock beam, I have to force up the lower control arm. A ratchet strap would work perfectly, but I don't have one. Okay, now I just need to rotate these grease seals to make sure they're in the right spot. A little nub here, and that aligns with the notch in the opening of the control arm. Okay, if I don't get that exactly right, it'll crush the washer. Don't want that to happen. When the link pin is seated in here correctly, this opens up so that the bolts can fit through. I like to put anti-seize in all my chassis bolts. A nut and a bolt and a lock washer that holds this whole thing in place. Another one on the bottom. This gets torqued down to 32. Okay, I'm gonna grease this up. And now we're ready to move on. Just gotta do the lower. I repeat the process of bolting on my spindles on the right side of the car, and now I'm ready to move on to the steering box. On the right is the steering box that came out of this car. That's an original Volkswagen steering box, and the problem with it is that it's completely worn out, and as you can see, the oil is starting to leak out of it. So I'm not going to use this steering box. This steering box is an aftermarket box made by TRW, and these are actually no longer available. I bought this a couple of years ago from a guy I met on the Samba website, and this guy took it apart and rebuilt it. A new TRW box, so lower bushings are new, upper cover is new. Both shafts are new. Replace the seals and bearings with better seals and with the original FAG bearings. Proper grease and proper adjustment. All right, so this rag joint right here is this cheap junk that I bought before I knew any better. I think it's probably made in China. And the reason it makes me nervous is because they don't really have a great reputation. There's a chance that there could be some electrical conductivity in this rubber, and that would make your horn honk all the time. And also, I don't know if this thing will just fall apart and I would lose my steering. So to be safe, I'm not going to use this. I replaced this with a German rag joint, that I bought from the same people who sold me my rebuilt Kingpins. This one is Febby Bilstein brand, and I recommend you get that for your project. You know, when it comes to safety, you can't really compromise on that. These shafts here that get connected to the steering column and to the steering box, they're unpainted. On the inside, this is unpainted. On the outside, that's not painted. I'm going to put some anti-seize on there so it doesn't, you know, get all rusty. And I decided to reuse the original castle nuts. They take a cotter pin. You always have the option of replacing these with nylock nuts, but I like the idea of using the original nuts on it just to preserve some of the history and originality to the car. And right here, this is the little tab with the horn. The wire comes down the steering column, plugs in here, and then the horn is grounded through here to the steering box and the chassis back to the battery. Okay, so now I need to install my steering arm or my Pitman arm onto the bottom of the steering box. And there's just this one bolt here that holds it on, gets torqued down to 50 foot-pounds. And there's some splines in here that fit onto the spline on the bottom of the shaft right there. And there's also this retaining plate on the side here. And the way this works is very simple. There's 3 tabs on it. The 2 smaller tabs go against the arm. And when this bolt is installed, this tab here, the bigger piece, will fold up against the side of the bolt so it doesn't have a chance to back out. And make sure that everything is oriented the right way. So the longer side of the Pitman arm, where my thumb is right here, goes towards the driver's side. Okay, when it comes to mounting the steering box on the beam, you need to know what your angle is. On a Karmann Ghia, it's angled a little lower than the Beetle. The Beetle driver sits higher than a Karmann Ghia driver. And the way that's done is with this bracket. There's a number 13 here stamped for Beetle, 14 stamped for Karmann Ghia. And so you're supposed to align these notches with the proper mounting point in the beam. So these 2 mounting points, or nubs or whatever you want to call them, are used to just position the steering box in the right spot on the beam. There's supposed to be another one underneath here, but there isn't on this beam. So unfortunately, I don't know the correct angle for the steering box right now, and I won't know until the body is mounted and I have the steering column set up. So for now, I'm going to bolt this on and I'm going to leave it loose so that I can rotate it to where it needs to be later on. Good and messy. Put the retaining tabs on there, and the steering box is going to sit between these tabs. I'm going to put it on here like that. Get my mounting bracket and put it underneath. Can't really see what I'm doing. Oh, here we go. Got it in. Not going to tighten it all the way because I really don't know what the angle should be. Here's the bolt for the Pitman arm. This gets torqued up to 50 foot-pounds. Okay. All right, well, that's not coming off. Okay, so here's my driver's side tie rod and tie rod ends. And just to remind myself that the angled tie rod end is the inner tie rod, and it goes on to the steering arm. And the non-angled tie rod end goes towards the wheel. And the way these things work is kind of cool. There's one of these is left-hand threaded, one is right-hand threaded. And when this is installed, you spin this tube and the tie rod will lengthen or shorten, and that sets up your front end alignment. Before I install these, I've twisted both of them in so that there's an equal amount of threads on both sides coming out of the tube. With the wheels off the ground and nothing to push up against the spindles, I have to rotate the steering box a little bit so I can line up the tie rod ends and loosely bolt them into place for now. Okay, put in the passenger side tie rod end. The longer passenger side tie rod goes in the same way. Again, I need to slightly rotate the steering box to get it in place. There's an opening in this tie rod for the steering dampener, and that end goes towards the driver's side, towards the steering box. Okay, gotta torque these down to 22 foot-pounds. Read this upside down somehow. Poke my head under here,
Okay. Okay, so the tie rods are all torqued up, and now I'm ready for my steering dampener. Gonna put some anti-seize on here. This really isn't hard at all. It's literally just 2 bolts. The trick is to put the angled stud through the tie rod end first, get the nut on loosely, and then attach the other end to the beam. Otherwise, it won't fit. Snug these down. Okay, this one gets torqued down to 18. All right, and this one gets tightened to around 30. All right, this anti-seize, I'm not really good working with this stuff. Got all over my hands and got everywhere. Here's a little trick for pre-adjusting your tie rod. So these are the original tie rods that came off the beam, and chances are the car was close to being aligned when it was dismantled. It had an alignment at some point, so this can't be too far off from where I need to be. So if I measure from end to end, center to center, okay, so this is 30.75 inches. So if I make my long tie rod 30.75 inches, that should get me close to being in alignment until I get the car put together and taken to an alignment shop. And this one right here is 14.5. Ooh, that's not far off. Tighten up just a hair. Okay, so that's right about where I need to be. This is no substitute for professional alignment, but for now it is. And this is way off like a half an inch. Okay, that's actually good right there. You can really see the difference in how these things are made, the new ones compared to the original. And they have 2 nuts on here, and then there's this locking plate so it doesn't slip out of alignment. And this new tie rod, I mean, I'm sure it'll work fine, but there's only this one adjusting nut and no way to really lock it down. So I'll tighten it, get it real snug best I can, and hopefully this won't come loose as I'm driving down the road. But this is just an example or demonstration of the difference between original and aftermarket. Okay, next I'm going to install the shock absorber, but there's a little problem here with the control arm that I want to zoom in on. Okay, so right here is the lower control arm, and this is a stud that sticks out where the lower part of the shock absorber is supposed to slide over this, but as you can see, it won't go on. It's too tight, and that's because this was mistakenly powder coated. So I have to take this off in order to fit the shock on. I'm actually just going to get out some sandpaper and sand this down real quick. Okay, let's see if this fits. All right. Okay, it's actually not such a bad thing that there's a little bit of powder coating left on here, because this is really prone to getting rusted. And so when you change your shock absorbers, the metal sleeve is stuck to this and it's all pitted and rusted. So this might actually have a little bit of advantage to it. So it's a happy accident. And what I'm gonna do is put some anti-seize on here anyway. And I also have new hardware for the top. Nice and coated. So I've got a big spring washer that goes on here first. Then I slip the bottom in, like so. And then a small spring washer, and then the nut. And then I just stretch the shock absorber into position, and the 2 spring washers go on the inner and outer side of this long bolt. Okay, the top bolt gets torqued down to 14, and the bottom gets torqued down to 22. Okay, that's 22. Okay, we'll get this all tightened up and torqued down just like the driver's side, and then gonna move on to the sway bar. Okay, the final piece here is the sway bar. I've never put one of these on before, so let's see how this goes. The larger bushing goes on there like that. Slide it down, squeak it down.
The large bushing is followed by the smaller bushing.
I don't have an assistant, but I do have some zip ties.
Then to hold the sway bar in place, I use a pair of zip ties to hold both ends up.
Okay, so you have the bigger bushing goes towards the inside, the smaller bushing goes towards the outside, and that's just common sense because it's wider here and narrower here. So these push up against the control arm. Then you're going to want to find yourself a very large set of pliers like these. And I have some new hardware for it. You want to make sure that the wider end points towards the wheel. Okay, move this up a little bit. I'm going to squeeze this down. Hold it tight with one hand. Okay. That was easier than I thought. Ideally, the car would be a little higher up. This would be easier to do. Working on the floor is kind of a drag.
So if I had forearms the size of Popeye, squeezing this wrench and holding it in place wouldn't be so hard. But right now, it's getting a little bit awkward.
And squeeze. If I can get this thing on.
If you don't have anyone helping you, just keep working at it, and eventually you'll get it.
Okay, got it.
The idea here is to bend the tabs upwards so the locking plate doesn't slide out. But because I'm not getting the hang of it, the plates are sliding off as I hammer.
All right, send in the brute squad.
Hammering upwards while sitting on the floor is super awkward, so I'm just going to use my giant pliers to bend the tabs up.
Here it is. Here's the finished beam. I'm pretty proud of it. Hopefully it's going to give me many years of trouble-free service. But right now I'd like to share in summary some tips I learned along the way.
I realized that maybe I put too much paint on here because the steering box is the ground for the horn. So I'm going to take a little paint off underneath the steering box and a little paint off behind where it bolts onto the frame head in order to get a good ground for the horn. Okay, so when it comes to powder coating or painting your control arms, make sure that the stud where you mount your shock absorber isn't coated, and also the area here, the link pin, this is the end of the link pin, it's going to slide through this hollow opening in the control arm on both upper and lower. You want to make sure you don't get any powder coating in there either, because if you do, you won't be able to fit your link pins in. So when it comes to the choice of either painting your bare beam or powder coating your bare beam, I spoke to the expert and he said definitely don't powder coat the beam. And the reason is it's really easy for the powder coating material to get inside and get baked onto the needle bearings. And if those get ruined, you have to pull all four out and replace them with most likely aftermarket parts that don't work as well. So I just decided to sand it down and paint it, and that's what I recommend you do too. Okay, if you made it this far into the video without falling asleep, you can do it too. All you need is the correct parts, some tools, and a big pile of cash.
It's a waste of money and a waste of time. Italian bastard child.